The Buffalo Bills have made two additions to the roster, and mandatory minicamps are underway. Was James Cook in attendance? We're going to talk about that on the Wandering Buffalo podcast.
You're now listening to the Wandering Buffalo podcast with your host, Justin Goddard.
Bills Mafia, welcome into another episode of the Wandering Buffalo podcast, a show on the Buffalo FamBase podcast network. My name is Justin, and I am your host as always, and getting into some real football conversation here, at least for the time being. Mandatory minicamps underway across the league, and the Bills have started their own. Of course, this is kind of our last big real football things happening until we get to training camp. Not a ton to glean from these practices as they're, unpadded practices. A lot of people aren't going to be participating and whatnot, but still a few things to talk about today. But before we get to that, want to start with a couple of additions that the Bills have made to their roster, And a lot of times, this time of year, we see a name pop up as an addition, and rightfully so, we jump right to it's a camp body. They're not going to make the team. Maybe somebody that's had some stints somewhere. Maybe, an older player that we don't think is likely to make the roster. Things like that. So the first signing is a player that I would kind of caution that with. I think there is a path to this player possibly making the roster. And that is the signing of Shaq Thompson, former Carolina Panther, first-round pick from, being in McDermott's time together in Carolina. And, for as far as we've stretched this Carolina pipeline, might be one of the last players that will come over from that pipeline. But this is a player that I am actually a bit intrigued by. On the wrong side of 30, coming off of 2 season-ending injuries, so you don't love that. I believe it was 2 years ago, broken fibula, and last year a ruptured Achilles that he's still kind of recovering from. But when I have some level of intrigue in this addition, it's not for him to be a starter. We have Matt Milano, we have Terrell Bernard, we have Dorian Williams as the primary backup, at least for Milano. We haven't really seen him be the primary backup for Terrell Bernard. But this is a room that I think needed some additions. We went through the draft, we went through free agency, and it was the exact players that we had last year coming back this year. And I'm excited about the players that we have there. I think we see a guy like Buffalo Joe and how exciting he was in the preseason and what he can do in his second year and, be able to develop and carve out a little bit more of a role. I think Balen Spector has played pretty well when he's got opportunities, but he also hasn't been able to stay healthy. We have Edefwan Ulufosio, who we haven't seen a ton from. So I think that we have some interesting players in the mix, but none of these depth guys that we have should be precluded from having competition. And I think that's what you do in Shaq Thompson. And who knows how this all shakes out. Maybe he is a camp body and he ends up getting cut. Maybe he ends up being a break glass in case of emergency, practice squad guy. And even if that ends up being his role, I don't hate that. And I think that's my favorite part of this signing is there's for me, there's really no bad angle from it. I guess the worst I can say is he's coming back from that Achilles, but you're also hoping that you don't have injuries that he would have to play any sort of meaningful snaps anytime soon. And I do think there's something to be said for this pipeline that Bean and McDermott like to tap into. And it's not just Carolina, it's guys that have bounced around, whatever, that they have some level of familiarity with. But for me, when it comes to kind of depth additions, especially if it's kind of just that camp body competition, I don't mind players that have been around and have familiarity. You're not spending extra time coaching this guy up on like your scheme and your languaging and expectations for the position. You have somebody that's coming in that already knows how you operate all that. You know how the coaching staff wants to run your practices. And to me, instead of bringing in some other guy that hasn't spent any time with your organization that, might be a similar skill set, 10 years in the league, whatever, but they've never been around you, it just adds another guy that you're coaching up while you're trying to onboard rookies, while you're trying to bring in the new players. And I might have a little bit more criticism for that pipeline approach if we were talking like, an impact starter that you passed on other options to just have the familiarity. But when we're talking that depth position, running through practices in June, I think that really only helps you bring along guys. I do think the interesting layer to this conversation when we're talking about a path to making the roster, because I could see a path as a depth guy. Bale Inspector is a guy that the teams, seem to really like, and the biggest issue with him is staying healthy. And we're only in mandatory mini camps, and Bale Inspector wasn't a full participant because he's dealing with an injury. So, I mean, it's unfortunate for Spector, but is there a path that he could get bumped off of this roster, in favor of a guy like Shaq Thompson? Spector's in the last year of his rookie deal. Maybe you just want to keep that cheap labor one more year. But I could see that being a path for Shaq Thompson having a role on this team. What I think complicates this conversation, and I think we also see this in the cornerback room, is where you're going to be getting all your special teams contributions from. And this has been a team that's, really like to focus on special teams. For the longest, we had, tons of special teams only guys that you never wanted to see take the field. On the offensive or defensive side of the ball, thinking guys like Taiwan Jones, Saran Neal, Tyler Medikevich, you know the names that have been around this team. Where are you getting those contributions from when you're kind of lacking in guys like that? And you look at a guy like Shaq Thompson. You didn't bring him in to be a special teams guy. You get to the cornerback room and you're looking at, yeah, can Trey White secure a roster spot? Well, he's not really a special teams guy either. And the linebacker and the cornerback positions in particular are typically, if you're going to be active on game day and get a jersey, but you're not one of the starters, you're usually making some contributions on special teams. We also see Quentin Morris leave this year in free agency. He was a four-phase special teamer. So I think that's an interesting layer to this conversation of, are there going to be difficult roster decisions to make because you have to round out special teams? So we'll see what happens there. The other addition that the Bills have made, this one was over the weekend, was defensive tackle Marcus Harris. Now, this one I do feel pretty confident in labeling just a camp body, but we'll play the football. We'll see what happens. Marcus Harris was a 7th-round pick from Houston in last year's draft. He ends up on their practice squad, gets released from their practice squad, heads over to the Patriots, signed to their practice squad, got a futures contract, and now ends up with the Bills. I have a very hard time seeing a path to this guy making the roster in maybe, we'll talk about this a lot throughout the offseason. Maybe a practice squad body, maybe. But with the investments that the team has made to the defensive tackle room, I just find this one to be a hard sell. It's another one of these guys that's a little bit undersized for the position, which the Bills have shown they are not really concerned about, but 6'2", 286. And we're talking a room that already had Ed Oliver, Daquan Jones, added, Michael Hoyt if you want to slot him in as a defensive tackle. He could be edge, defensive tackle, linebacker. Hoyt is somebody that I'm factoring into the numbers at defensive tackle for these types of conversations. Added Larry Ogunjobi, obviously in the draft, added Deion Walker, added TJ Sanders. Dwayne Carter still in the mix from last year. It's really hard for me to see a path for Marcus Williams to make this roster, but you had room to add somebody, so you did, and the Bills are now officially at 91 on their roster. They do get to have that extra player with the International Players Pathway program. So, Bills sitting at 91. Any moves that you see coming up, any additions, will have a corresponding move with it. I'm sure we'll see a lot of that bottom end of the depth chart tinkering as we, move throughout the summer. We know Brandon Beane likes to really tinker with that bottom end of the depth chart throughout the summer, so we'll stay tuned to see what happens there. For the mandatory minicamp itself, obviously the big news everybody was watching for here was, would James Cook report to the mandatory portion of the program? And, one day, I'll start by saying I had full expectations of James Cook showing up to this practice or to this mandatory minicamp. I don't think that there's much sense for a player on a rookie deal to miss these practices, even if, they're amidst a contract dispute. They haven't gotten that big payday in the NFL. You're losing money as soon as you don't show up. Also, probably not the foot you want to put forward to a team you're trying to get to give you a big payday, is that you're not showing up and doing what they want you to do. So I don't think that there was ever a point where I thought it made much sense for James Cook to not be there. So it wasn't a huge surprise for me. But, ultimately you never know what the players are going to do and if they're going to show up or not. So we then had Adam Schefter, one day before camp gets underway, reporting, basically don't expect James Cook anytime soon. Maybe this thing could get ugly, all that. And, it was something like 12 hours later, we see him there. And shout out to my guy Nate and the fellas over there at CTW. First person I saw with the scoop that, James Cook was in Buffalo and going to be in attendance. So kind of honestly, kind of a big moment to have the scoop and a better idea of what's going on than Adam Schefter. We got knowledge bombs named after Adam Schefter with the Shefty bombs. So to kind of be able to contradict Adam Schefter in that close of succession and be right about it. Pretty cool for the fellas over there at CTW. But like I said, logistically didn't make sense to me for him to not be in attendance. So then the second layer to that was, is this like a hold-in situation where he's going to be there, but he's not going to participate? You know, we've seen this in the past. A guy, you know, wants a new contract and they show up, but oh man, I've had this nagging hamstring injury, so I'm here, but I'm not going to do anything. And this was kind of the surprise to me. It was that he was a full participant, said he intends to be a full participant throughout this session. And, you know, that's the one where we kind of see the players with with their power moves of, yeah, I'm here, you're going to pay me, but I'm not doing anything. And, you know, some players don't want to risk an injury if they don't have that contract with the guarantees they want. And I think it's cool to see James Cook is there. He is participating. And as much as we don't like these contract disputes and how they play out, and we may not have liked everything James Cook has done handling it thus far, him being there and being an active participant, it's not nothing. He did make himself available to the media as well, and the quote from him that I have seen all over social media, and it's just been like this one-liner without the context of anything else he said, is that he's there because he likes his money. Oh, okay. If I had to give up something like $20,000 per day that I miss these practices, I'd probably be there too. But I feel like it's intentionally being put out there in that format to have it be like the only thing that he said was that he's there because he likes his money. He also went on to say that he's part of a team, and him being there is important to having a winning team. He's there because the goal is to win a Super Bowl, and him being there is important. That's also not nothing nothing to me. I know the sexier headline here is James Cook is there because he likes money. He also said a lot of other things that, you know, weren't just like the optics of a me guy that's only here because of the money. He also said that he's happy for his teammates that got paid. You know, seeing Khalil Shakir, seeing Gert, these guys were in the same draft class and they all got paid. And I think this is part of the business end of the NFL, where these conversations typically are happening when we're in the off season and there's not a ton to talk about. And I think as fans, particularly in this slow time of year, I think some of these distraction conversations get a little bit out of proportion. I think it's something in the NFL that's very widely known and accepted, that there's like the, the team and the players and the guys in the locker room, and then there's the front office, there's the business side of it, and it's kind of like your coworkers and your bosses. And I'm sure everybody's worked a job where they love their coworkers, but they got a problem with the boss. And that's kind of how I see these contract situations. And not even necessarily that they have like a problem with the boss, just some business that they're working through. But it's pretty universally discussed and, you know, accepted in the NFL that there's the team side of it and there's the organization side of it. And these players want to see each other get paid. They're rooting for the teammates, especially in Buffalo. It feels like, you know, a super tight knit group. I think it does have the propensity to turn into more of a distraction if the guy is holding out or if they're doing the hold in and, what their actions are while they're not participating. It sounds like the way James Cook is conducting himself, this isn't going to be, a distraction. We'll see what happens, but I think for his quest to get $15-20 million, that this is kind of really the first step to doing it. I still don't think we see a deal get done before the season, and I could be wrong there. Maybe Brandon Bean sees Cook showing up. He looks great, and what he wanted to see out of Cook was, showing up and putting in the work. I don't know. Maybe he gets paid before the season. I think that, like I said on last week's episode, I think this stretches into next year, and it's a conversation that we're going to keep having. But for James Cook to go out and get that money that he's looking for from the Bills or from another team, his best path forward is to show up, be around, not be a distraction, put in the work, and go have a monster season. So I think this is kind of the first step to that. Want to wrap up today talking about just some players that weren't not participating or limited participants just due to injuries. We've seen guys that have some off-season surgeries, some lingering stuff that they're kind of, slow playing it. And the messaging around most of these guys was, nothing concerning about them missing time for training camp, just kind of taking things slow right now as, they're in the off-season phase. But guys that were either limited or did not participate were wide receiver KJ Hamler, cornerback Taron Johnson, Swiss Army knife Cam Lewis, Connor McGovern. We all knew about Joey Bosa. We all were not surprised by Balin Spector, Cole Bishop, DamarHamlin, and Ty Johnson. And, basically, I'm going to take all these injuries that they're talking about at face value. If they're telling me there's no concern for anybody missing training camp, I'm gonna believe that. I feel like they're pretty honest about injuries overall. I do think that the one bright side was see video clips out there of Joey Bosa, doing some individual stuff, running. Kind of tells me that this wasn't, some sort of severe calf strain. The soft tissue injuries are always concerning for these big jacked up dudes. So good to see him participating to some extent. The three injuries that I think are kind of important here would be Cam Lewis, Cole Bishop, and DamarHamlin. And these injuries aren't, I guess, as concerning for me for the players themselves. It did kind of suck seeing that Cole Bishop isn't participating. There's been so much conversation about how important like these install parts of the years are for younger players. And, sounds like last year it was kind of the X's and O's and the scheme that was keeping him off the field early. So not really in love with him missing this time. As far as Cam Lewis and DamarHamlin go, I think that this could be a little bit concerning on their end of just the opportunities that this creates for Jordan Hancock and Derek Forrest. And these are two guys that were, brought in this offseason, one through free agency, one through the draft, that I think are kind of swings on upgrading those positions, whether it's starters or depth. I think Hancock kind of factors into this equation as maybe a year one replacement for Cam Lewis, maybe a long-term replacement for Taron Johnson. But, this wasn't like an undrafted player that they added that, we'll see what happens. There's a draft pick investment there. Derek Forrest, it's not a huge contract. There's not a lot of guarantees, but it's a guy that they went out and chose to add to the roster. I know DamarHamlin was also brought back, but it's a 1 year, very minimum type deal. Nothing really guaranteeing a roster spot if, some of these other guys can shine. And Derek Forrest is somebody that I'm super intrigued with. I think he was really developing nicely in Washington and kind of lost his spot due to injury and then a regime change. And we're going to bring in our own guys type deal. And I think there's some real potential there for Forrest to have a role. So I think those players are, have the most implications to missing these, small practice sessions in early June. We'll see what happens when the pads come on, when we get to training camp, all that. But a room for opportunity for two players that I think have the potential to be on the outs and two players that I think could be in line to be taking on decent roles in Buffalo. So couple of guys that as we get closer to training camp, couple position groups that are going to be ones that are like my position battles to watch. These names that we're talking about right now are going to be interesting position battles as we get into training camp. So I don't like seeing injuries. I hate that Cole Bishop isn't, participating. I do love seeing the opportunity for Hancock and Forrest to be able to have an opportunity to make an early impression as, we're in early June. But that's going to do it for today's episode of The Wandering Buffalo. I do appreciate you being here. As always, I kindly ask that you will like, share, subscribe, tell a friend about the show. Anything you can do does really help us bring out these episodes every week. Next week, we're going to talk more about, the rest of what happened with these mandatory mini camps. And we're getting pretty close to my way too early 53-man roster projection. Been working on that a little bit now that we officially have, our full 91. Going to start playing with that. We'll do a couple renditions of that throughout the summer. But make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any of these episodes. Thank you again for being here. We'll see you next week. And until then, and as always, go Bills.